Hi guys, it is Mrs. Nixon here again with another story. I'm in my bathroom again reading our stories because my bathroom is the quietest place in my house at the moment. When we're all locked down, I have 4 sons and a husband, and so it is very noisy in my house sometimes. And that's really funny because today's story is all about Mr. Noisy. I think sometimes my boys are definitely Mr. Noisies, but I hope you're not going to be Mr. Noisy whenever I'm reading our story. No, you're going to be nice and Mr. Quiet, aren't you? Let's see what he says. Mr. Noisy was a very, very noisy person indeed. For example, if Mr. Noisy was reading this story to you, he'd be shouting at the top of his voice. And the top of Mr. Noisy's voice is a very loud place indeed. You can hear it 100 miles away. That's a long way. Another example. Most people, when they sneeze, you can maybe hear it in the next room. A tissue. But when Mr. Noisy sneezes, you can hear him in the next country. Well, our story today starts when Mr. Noisy was asleep in bed, in his bedroom, in his house, which is on the top of a hill. He was snoring. And as you can imagine, well, when Mr. Noisy snores, it is a snore that you can hear all over the place. It sounds like a herd of elephants more than it sounds like a snore. Then Mr. Noisy's alarm clock goes off. And Mr. Noisy's alarm clock is not like your alarm clock or my alarm clock. It sounds like a fire engine. Mr. Noisy woke up. And so too did all of the people who lived in Wobbletown, which is a town at the bottom of Mr. Noisy's hill. Oh dear, I don't know whether they wanted all to be woken up. Do you think so? Later that day, Mr. Noisy decided that he wanted to go shopping. He went out of his house and he shut the door behind him. Bang! The door wobbled. The house wobbled. The whole hill wobbled. And Wobbletown wobbled. Even a bird flying high in the sky wobbled. Whew. Then Mr. Noisy walked down the hill. Clump, clump, clump. He went into the baker's shop. Crash went the door as he went in. Bang went the door when he shut it. I'd like a loaf of bread, boomed Mr. Noisy to Mrs. Crumb, the baker's wife. Mrs. Crumb trembled and sold him a loaf of bread. Then Mr. Noisy walked along the street to the butcher's. Clump, clump, clump. He walked into the butcher's shop. Crash went the door as he opened it. Bang went the door as he shut it. I'd like a piece of meat, boomed Mr. Noisy to Mr. Bacon, the butcher. Mr. Bacon trembled and sold him some meat. Afterwards, Mrs. Crumb met Mr. Bacon in the street. We really must do something about Mr. Noisy being so noisy, she said. Absolutely, but what? I know. And she whispered a plan into Mr. Bacon's ear. Oh, Mr. Bacon grinned a big grin. I think you have the answer, he said. Oh, I can't wait to see what it is. The following day, Mr. Noisy once again woke up and went shopping in Wobbletown. Clump, clump, clump. He walked in to little Miss Crumb's shop. I'd like a loaf of bread, he boomed. I'm sorry, what did you say? Asked little Miss Crumb, pretending not to hear. I'd like a loaf of bread, Mr. Noisy shouted. I'm sorry, I can't hear what you're saying, said Mrs. Crumb, putting her hand up to her ear. Can you speak up a bit? I'd like a loaf of bread, roared Mr. Noisy. I can't hear you, said Mrs. Crumb. Mr. Noisy gave up and went out. Next, he tried Mr. Bacon's shop. I'd like a piece of meat, he boomed. Mr. Bacon pretended not to notice him. I'd like a piece of meat, said Mr. Noisy again. Oh, sorry, did you say something? Asked Mr. Bacon. I said I'd like a piece of meat, roared Mr. Noisy. Pardon? Said Mr. Bacon. Mr. Noisy gave up and went out and went home and went to bed, hungry. The day after, Mr. Noisy tried again. He went to Mrs. Crumb's shop. I'd like a loaf of bread, he boomed. A what? Asked Mrs. Crumb. Mr. Noisy started shouting at the very top of his voice, a loaf of... And then he stopped. And he thought. And he said very quietly, I'd like a loaf of bread, please, Mrs. Crumb. Mrs. Crumb smiled. Certainly, she said. Then Mr. Noisy went into Mr. Bacon's shop. I'd like a piece of meat, he boomed. Oh, sorry, did you say something? Asked Mr. Bacon. Yes, I did. And then, very quietly, he said, I'd like a piece of meat, please, Mr. Bacon. Mr. Bacon smiled. My pleasure, he said. So, carrying his meat and his bread, Mr. Noisy set off home up the hill. Clump, clump, clump. Then he stopped. And he thought. And do you know what he did then? He tiptoed. Tiptoeing was not something Mr. Noisy had ever done in his life. And it was so fun. Mr. Noisy arrived at his front door. He put his hand to open the door and then stopped and thought. And you know what he did? He opened the door really quietly and he stepped inside and closed the door really quietly. Quietly and gently were not something that Mr. Noisy had ever tried before either. And that was lots of fun too. And do you know something? From then until now, Mr. Noisy isn't anything like as noisy as he used to be. And do you know something else? The people of Wobbletown are delighted, especially Mrs. Crumb and Mr. Bacon. And do you know something else? Mr. Noisy has learnt how to whisper. Do you know how to whisper? Well, I hope that you are using your inside voice when you're at home and that you're whispering so that you don't give your mummy or your daddy or your granny or your granda a sore head. because I think that's what Mr. Noisy would be giving me. I hope that you're all staying safe and that you're all having a great time. And I'll see you again for some more stories soon.